Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Heidi Horsley, and we are in partnership with the Association for Deaf Educators and Counselors. And I'm here today talking about moving on doesn't mean letting go. And I love the title for this show because when my brother Scott died at 17, I definitely didn't feel like I ever had to let go of him. He is such a big part of my life, and he is my guiding light and the reason that I do Open to Hope. So the reason that I was inspired to name the show Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go is because one of our guests today actually wrote a book with this very same name. And we are going to be talking to her and some other people that are experts in the field of grief and loss. So I will introduce our guests today. So right next to me is Gina, the one that wrote the book. Hello, Gina. And Gina Maffa is a licensed psychotherapist, a mental health counselor, and media consultant in New York City. She's been in practice for nearly 2 decades and has helped hundreds of people seeking treatment for trauma and grief. She has authored the book that I'm talking about, Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go. Hi, Gina. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Heidi. Thank you so much for having me.
It's great having you here today, and I'm looking forward to talking about your book. So before we do that, we're going to introduce our other guests. So next to you is Dr. Wendy Lichtenthal. And Wendy has been on some podcasts. You can go to Open to Hope and look at those. She is a psychologist, the director of the Center for Advancement of Bereavement Care at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center, and she is associate professor pending rank at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. She has been at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center since 2005, where she was founding director of the Bereavement Clinic. She is also part of a federally funded research project in the area of grief and loss. Welcome to our show, Wendy.
Thank you, Heidi. So glad to be here.
So great to have you again. And Heather is right next to her. And again, Heather has been on our shows before, so you can go to Open to Hope and look at some shows she's done. Heather Stang is the author of Mindfulness and Grief and the Guided Journal From Grief to Peace. Heather hosts the Mindfulness and Grief podcast and offers mindfulness-based grief support online through her organization, the Mindfulness Grief Institute. Heather facilitates an online support program that includes meditation, grief yoga, and journaling. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you for having me back, Heidi.
It's so good to have all three of you here, and you're all therapists with different backgrounds, so we'll talk more about that. And I want to start with Gina because we are going to highlight her book today. So Gina, I know your book takes an honest look at how grief affects our lives, and that your mom has been a big inspiration for this book. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Absolutely. Her name is Rose, and she was a quintessential Italian mother and loved family around her, loved to be at home cooking and having parties, and somewhat a little bit overprotective at times, one would say, but I always felt somebody was wondering where I was, and always felt somebody was looking out for me, which you don't think about until you don't have it anymore. The kind of person you know is missing in your life when your birthday comes and you don't hear from them.
And she got cancer.
She got cancer. She was misdiagnosed for over a year.
Wow.
They said that she had a dry cough, and they said that she had acid reflux. Then they said she had allergies. So they were treating her for a really long period of time for all the wrong things without really giving her the proper x-rays. When she finally had to advocate for herself, they did a CAT scan and saw that it was a stage 4 lung cancer.
Wow.
But upon even investigating further, they realized it was colon cancer cells that migrated up to her lungs and her bronchial tubes. And at that time, they gave her 6 months to live. She did live a little bit over a year, but it was much shorter than it would have been had they actually caught it early on.
Wow.
So,
and you said she died 6 years ago, right?
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's traumatic. And like you said, how do we live without our parents? I mean, like, what does our life look like? Who are we? My father died 3 years ago. He had a staph infection during COVID, went into the hospital, and I couldn't see him because it was COVID. And we didn't think he was going to die, but he did end up dying. So it's been really interesting and really difficult without him, especially the first. I mean, it's like the first few years I've had to say, who am I without my dad? And also, you know, I think we call our parents when we accomplish something. We can't wait to tell them. They're so proud of us.
Yeah.
And now, you know, your mom and my dad aren't here. So it's a big transition in our lives.
It is.
And I love that you wrote this book as a way to talk about moving on doesn't mean letting go, because it really doesn't. Wendy, does this bring up anything for you?
Absolutely. For me, the loss of my father inspired my work as well. So I lost my dad when I was 13 going on 14. So it really shaped my identity, in fact, and thinking of what it was to cope with grief and to feel the suffering of that and wonder why aren't people doing something about this? This stinks. So I just remember the kind of angst of adolescence and missing him in all the ways you guys are talking about, just really wanting his presence for accomplishments, for hard times. I was very, very close with him. And for me, I think very similar, Gina, finding the meaning through engaging in something that could help others became the path.
Yeah.
Very much. Yeah.
And Heather, what are your thoughts about this?
I mean, my work is a direct line with a couple off ramps here and there, but my first major loss was when I was 7, and my mother's brother, Doug, died by suicide. And a few years before that, my father's only brother, Don, had died from a brain tumor related, like developmental disability his whole life. And so at the age of 7, my entire family ecosystem, both sets of grandparents were bereaved parents, both of my parents were bereaved siblings, and I am an only child, so I often joke, but it's not a joke, that the one adult I could have told my secrets to, left the building, and that's something I think of all the time. My mother and I talk about him. I know I'm, further down than a lot of people in terms of that time, the time between loss. But you never forget. You never forget. And if you're in a place where you can remember them and smile, and actually bring their lives into your lives, I don't want to call it a gift, because I don't think grief is something we're ever glad about, but I think it is a gift that we have that connection still.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because at first when I talk to clients, or when I even think about forming connections and continuing bonds, initially I was kind of offended by that.
Yeah.
Because people would talk about, oh, your brother will always be in your life and your dad's always going to be there. And I'm like, yeah, but I want him physically here. I don't want, a continuing bond. But then you realize, okay, that's never going to happen. So it's like plan B. How do we stay connected? Because we're not physically going to get them back. Gina, in your book, you talk about recognizing our unique grief rhythms. Tell me more about what that is.
I came upon this idea working with clients in my practice that everybody copes with hard things, whether it's traumatic events, a loss, or just a hard day, in their own way, in their own rhythm. I had someone whom I write about in my book, who would ride his bike and would cycle hundreds of miles, a week, and everyone thought that he wasn't grieving the death of his girlfriend from a car accident, and nobody was understanding, so they were confronting him that he wasn't grieving, and no one really understood that he wasn't escaping his grief. This was actually how he was coping. This was his rhythm, and he was a mover. That's one of the rhythms. And one of the ideas behind, I observed within my practice over the past few years, especially in COVID, that there were 8 particular rhythms, and there's probably many more. It's all really individual, and you can be all 8 or several at a time and go in and out. But that, it's important to know that how we cope with hard things can help us understand what steps to take when we're feeling stuck, or we can help people to understand really what we're going through if we can understand, or even show them what our rhythm is, so that people can understand our own unique grieving process and experience. Because as we all know, everybody grieves differently. It's just that sometimes we can feel really isolated and alone in our grief, and I think we do truly want to be connected, and we want people to understand what it is we're experiencing. And so this to me was sort of a knowledge is power moment for some of my clients who are feeling really confused.
Well, I love this because there is judgment about how people are grieving. And like you said, we all grieve, we grieve in different ways. And for this person, riding a bike, moving, was grieving.
Yeah.
And I know we talked before the show about Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and he's been on the show before, and he talks about how he wrote a book, The Body Keeps the Score, as you know, and he talks about how movement is part of getting trauma and grief out of our bodies,
Absolutely.
whether it be yoga, bike riding, walking, exercise of any kind. So it is so key. Wendy, I'm wondering, I know that you are on a federally funded research-based study and see you work with a lot of families who are grieving, and what would you say about all this, given the clients you work with?
So a lot of the work that we do in developing interventions for grievers, one of the main components of the work we do focuses on finding meaning after loss. So this idea of one of the things that is coming to my mind as I listen is the meaning we make of our own emotional reactions and the meaning we make of other people's emotional reactions. And I think some of understanding one's own, even that idea of a rhythm is a meaning-making tool, and it gives you that permission and allowance. So a lot of times what we're doing when we're working with people is helping them to understand that we even make meaning of our feelings. We all come to the table with a lens because we are taught different things or we're exposed to different rules about grieving or about what it is to just express and feel emotions at all. And that we can decide, we can choose what meaning we want to make of, for example, a wave of grief, or of whether going on a bike ride is good or bad. We get to choose. So I love this idea of empowering people with language like it's my grief rhythm. And then, of course, because we know support is so important, educating others that this is just the way I do it, because that obviously helping others to understand the meaning of your reactions is also important.
Absolutely.
I like this, and you'll all be able to identify with this. Well, after my brother died, my mother was a runner, and she stopped running for a few weeks, and then she said, she said to herself, I can't afford to get sick. I have 3 daughters still. Like, I've got to take care of myself. And she went out into the neighborhood and started running, and she was terrified that the neighbors were going to think she doesn't love her son, she's running. She doesn't care about him. So, like you said, giving people permission to do these things is so important, and realizing that this is part of helping them heal. Heather, I know that this is your sweet spot, because you are all about mind-body connection and yoga and somatic and meditation. Weigh in on this a little bit.
Absolutely. I remember one of the moments where I got really inspired to take my yoga therapy background into grief, and it was when I was in my Thanatology's master's program, and Dr. Terry Martin, who sadly died last year, was my professor, and he was teaching us about grief in the body. At the same time, I was reading his and Ken Doka's book, Grieving Beyond Gender, and there was a line in there that said something to the extent of, grief is an energy that needs to be expressed.
I love that.
But how we express that is so individual, and it's so in line with what you're sharing. Some people express it through walking through the supermarket crying and telling everybody they see. Some people go for a bike ride. Some people do yoga. For me, when my stepfather died suddenly and unexpectedly, I found the tools that I had used to cope with things like yoga and meditation oddly weren't what I needed to do. I went out and hit tennis balls against a wall and made sounds, like really loud sounds, and hit it. Even though from the outside someone would just think I'm practicing my serve, I was getting that anger out. And it's a very powerful to get into your body.
I like this, and anger is a legitimate emotion. I mean, some people will say to me, clients will say to me, yeah, my son isn't grieving, he's so angry. And I'm like, that is part of grief.
And that's actually something that showed up, I believe, in Mary Frances O'Connor's work, or somebody with the fMRI, that part of anger is kind of our attachment system, right? It's that sense that we've been left, even though it wasn't their fault. And I think that helps explain that I feel angry, but I'm not sure why feeling that we get. It's very human to feel that way.
Absolutely, and you can feel abandoned even though it's not rational. Because sometimes grief isn't rational.
Yeah.
When my father died, I was like, Dad, I need you. Like, you're abandoning me. I don't want you to be gone right now. I'm not ready. And it's a normal reaction.
The time frame can surprise you because all of these years later, I'm hitting the anger phase as my father sells our family home, and I'm angry at my mother for dying because if she didn't, he would still be there, and I wouldn't be losing her in this different way. And so I'm surprised that all of these years later, I'm hitting this place of anger. So
Yeah, it's interesting that the choices that our parents make after one parent dies, and sometimes we don't have control over that.
Right.
My mother actually sold our beach house in Carmel right after my dad died. And I was like, Mom, can I go back? Give me some time. She goes, no, I need to sell it now. And it was really hard.
Yeah.
Because like there's a lot of people in a family, and you just don't want that much change when you've lost your parent. So it's interesting because all of you, and Wendy, I've known you for a long time, and I knew you had a loss, but I didn't know that you had a loss of your dad when you were a teenager. So everyone here has had the death of parents and stepfathers. I'm wondering, what do you all think is unique about that kind of a loss? Gina, we'll start with you.
it's funny because, as you said earlier, it's the person you call to talk about your achievements. It's, for me, my mother was the person that I called when the best things happen, when the worst things happen, but also the only person I would trust to tell me what to throw away in my refrigerator, and so far more than Google. And so, she was the person that worried if I would be on the subway late at night. And the one person who actually, in my mind, and no grievance to my father, but it's different with a mother in a lot of ways, that she worried about me and my safety and my well-being. And I do feel really bereft of that feeling, that somebody's wondering about me and wondering if I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
And that's really feeling a unique loss for me.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
And Wendy?
I think for me, and again, I think it's so relationship specific, and it could be mother, father, it's just whatever that relationship was. For me, with my father, it was really accomplishment driven, and a lot was around making him proud. And so I think that at that moment, I was just about to start high school, thinking of all the academic future, everything that was going to lie ahead. I felt really lost without him, and I remember the kind of belly wails. I was no longer a young child, but it was just that as raw, just wanting him back. And similarly, because my mom ended up remarrying soon after, saying, if you were here, none of this would be happening right now, right? That feeling of like this, I want my old life back. I want it the way it was. So I think through the years that drive to make him proud, it's not as loud as it was years ago, but I think that was a North Star for a long time.
That's big for me also. That no one was more proud of my accomplishments than my father, academic and career. And without him here, I'm like, darn it, I can't call him and tell him what I'm doing. And he'd be so excited and so into it. Yeah, and you were so young, losing that cheerleader to say, yeah.
And driver. I mean, everything thereafter, I navigated. I mean, I remember one thing for me was I made a commitment to, not to discount my mom's role in it, but to raise myself well. So I was very centered on being a good girl, I guess, in many ways for him. But there was also trauma. I found him. Like there were other things going on in the background that were very much part of it. And I think as I think of people who may be watching, I think of as I have to go back now and think of how raw it was then and how much it's transformed. I know so much of part of when someone is looking for a light, it's wondering, will this change? And it does, right? So this idea that it was excruciating and raw and awful, and I felt so lost and couldn't imagine not feeling that way.
That's why we called our foundation the Open to Hope Foundation, because we didn't want to tell people to have hope, because that's minimizing a loss and that's annoying and irritating. But we wanted, my mom and I, we wanted them to be open to the idea that they might have hope again.
Is there a chance that I could feel different than I do today?
If I knew that people couldn't find hope again, I couldn't do this work. There's no way I could do it. It would
Yeah.
just be too depressing. So Heather, what are your thoughts in hearing all this? I know
You know, like every relationship is so special and unique,
Yes.
right? You know, with my stepfather, I walked in while they were trying to resuscitate him, so there was the
Wow.
trauma of that. And there was also an interesting factor that he and my mother were 4 days away from divorce, and I was trying to take care of him after surgery. So we had a very different relationship because he came into my life when I was 20. And he died my last semester of my thanatology program.
Wow.
And I think it's important for people to understand that just because we have all this information as professionals here,
Yeah.
that just like the people watching this show, we go through it. And we learn how to make meaning and how to live, and it does transform. For me, I'll just want to say briefly, Tom was a very special character in my life because we both ran businesses, we're both creative, like we were together almost every day. I'd go hang out at his photography shop, and he's with me almost every day now when I use his equipment for my podcast.
Wow.
And that's a very, you know, that's a legacy piece for me. And so when I'm doing my podcast, it's like I'm kind of channeling Tom's technical brilliance. You know, I wish he were still here, that desire for him to be physically here. And yet, since that is not possible, I am grateful that I can take the influence he had on my life.
Well, I love this because it's exactly what Gina's book is about. The fact that you have the equipment of your stepfather, that you're channeling him, that you're there, you know, thinking about him while you're doing your work is exactly what you're talking about, right?
Absolutely. I call my mother my invisible sidekick. The poor thing is working all the time. You know, I'm always asking her for help. You know, I couldn't get through even writing this book without her. There was so much there, but to me, the most important thing has been bringing her along with me in whatever way I possibly can, as a person, as a woman, as honoring her as best I can. But because I honestly think that even as a therapist working in this, that if I had to think she was gone, I couldn't survive it. And
So thinking that she just vanished rather than that she is here in another form.
Right.
She is with us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really comforting. I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think it's important to say though that for some people that's spiritual, but it doesn't need to be.
Absolutely.
Right? Like
Thank you.
it's inside of you because you know no one better and no one knew you better.
essence, yes.
Or the way you know exactly what they would say in a moment. And so
Yeah.
that part that's inside of you, whatever that means, that connection, it can be a belief that and an energy, a spirit, all of that, and that's amazing. And it also can be that knowledge of what has come from a profoundly important relationship.
Wendy, I think that's really important,
Yeah.
like you said, because we all have different belief systems.
Yeah.
And sometimes it'll just be for me, and I know y'all are going to relate to this, what would my father say to me right now? If he were here, what advice would he give me? You know, sometimes that's the connection. Heather?
Yeah, that's actually a journaling practice I give in Awaken, my online grief support program, and it comes through Bob Niemeyer and some other researchers, and it's a life imprint meditation, which I think originally was kind of offered as a journaling exercise, but it could be a meditation where you just sit down and reflect on your mannerisms, your tone of voice, your eye color, you know, if they're biologically related or if you were adopted and raised in the house, their hobbies, their business style, their belief system, like all of it. And it's a really beautiful practice to sit down and actually make that a meditative process to honor all of those ways that they imprinted on you. And then I will say a caveat, because let's face it, not all relationships are perfect.
Yes, good point.
And my stepfather, for instance, he did have bipolar disorder. My mother and he were getting divorced for a very good reason. I loved him deeply, and yet there's a lot I would let go.
Right.
And so writing down what you want to keep and writing down what you want to release.
I like this. Relationships are complicated, and we can love people, and they can also be complicated.
And for me,
These two
doing
things
that-
can exist.
Yeah, doing that exercise with him, I think moved me quicker to a place where and even my mother now, we can have great conversations about him. We've let go like what he did in his human life that was hurtful because we're here now, and it's been a real transformative process.
Well, we are going to wrap up, but before we do, I want to know where we can get a hold of you for those that are watching today. Gina?
It's GinaMaffa.com. I'm also on Instagram at GinaMaffaLCSW.
I love it. And where can people buy your book?
They can buy it anywhere books are sold that they feel comfortable with.
And please go in and even just read the first couple of pages. You can go to Amazon and do it right now. You will get the book because she dives right into the deep end of her loss from the very first sentence. And it is really powerful, and you're very candid, and you're very real, and you're very authentic. So I think a lot of people will find hope by reading this book, and they'll be able to identify with the pain that you've gone through in the journey. So thank you for writing this.
Thank you so much.
And Wendy, where do we find you?
On X, Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn, and my email is wendy.lichtenthal, it's LICHTENTHAL, @miami.edu.
And if there's a family out there that's had a loss, a cancer loss, and wants to get involved with your study, where would they find you?
So for our study right now for Meaning Center Grief Therapy is for parents who have lost a child to cancer specifically. We have another project that is where we're adapting it for parents who have lost a child to suicide. For both of those, you can email parent study, one word, at mskcc.org.
I love that you're doing this work. So if you've had a child die of cancer or if you've had a suicide loss, please contact Wendy, and you will be giving back and you will be changing the world in many, many ways. So thank you, Wendy, for doing that work. Heather?
You can find me at mindfulnessandgrief.com. There's a lot of free articles, as well as pretty much every month I offer a free journaling workshop online. And if you're interested in joining me in my grief support group, that's at meditationforgrief.com, heather.stang on Instagram, and also on X or Twitter, whatever we're calling it, Heather Stang.
I love it. Well, thanks so much for all you all do, and for the work that you're doing in the grief and loss space, and for helping people find hope again. And thank you for watching the show today. If you want to see shows like this and more information, go to opentohope.com. And we always say, if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.